Okay, thank you, Gal. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Thank you again for the opportunity, Gal, to present and to be part of Haruv from the couch and the wonderful work that you all have done. If there's a lot of you that have been on the other presentations, I was sharing with Christina and Gal before, I think they've done an outstanding job. I know a lot of groups around the nation that are putting together a lot of virtual things. The range of topics and the presenters that you brought to this in such a short time with such a broad reach is really pretty phenomenal. So you guys need to pat yourselves on the back. You've done an amazing amount of work and created an awesome virtual platform for a lot of great information for folks and helped a lot of folks who aren't getting out to get those CEUs that they needed too. So another very valuable piece here. So
thank you. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. I mean every word of that. Some of you may have heard of trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy before, maybe have some familiarity with it, may have colleagues that are using it, maybe using it yourself if you're a clinician. It has been in wide dissemination and implementation here in Oklahoma for over 10 years, and I'll talk more about that collaboration and partnership that, near the end. I'm hoping that you will stay for the full 90 minutes. I have a lot of resource material that I think you'll find very helpful about training, accessing clinicians, etc., near the end of the presentation. So I hope that you'll stay tuned for that, if you will. I do need to mention who the developers of the model are. The three model developers are Drs. Judy Cohen and Tony Manarino from Pittsburgh and Dr. Esther Deblinger from New Jersey, who developed and are the primary folks behind the implementation of the TF-CBT model. And I want to give some shout outs to some colleagues that I've trained with over the years who have contributed content to the materials that I'm going to share today, but also the content of the training in general. Typically, the TF-CBT training is done. I'll talk about how you can access virtual training at the end of the presentation today, as well as the process for how typically the training is done via live presentation following that, as well as consultative follow-up for individuals who are interested in learning to implement the model. So I did want to mention the developers here. And two, please, that the content of this material is proprietary, so we ask you to not re-release or reproduce the material once it's put online by Haruv without permission to do so. We ask you to please respect that. So who needs trauma-focused treatment? I want to spend a couple of moments talking about the why for why this model exists. And if anyone's been paying attention to the media lately, you know that the reports nationally for domestic violence calls are exploding exponentially. But concerningly, there has been a reduction in the number of calls for child abuse. And ostensibly, the ideas around that are the eyes on children that are usually happening through schools and other places that children are seen and supported are not taking place. Children are sequestered at home. Families are under tremendous stress right now, as evidenced by the increase in domestic violence, also the increase in overdose reports. Those kinds of things are really, really increasing. So we're in a sort of a secondary level of epidemic here of things that are occurring for kids and families. And my screen just locked up for some reason. There we go. Even our local news has talked about the impact and the reports of exposure to probable trauma for children as a result of the pandemic. Child welfare services are collapsed to smaller numbers. Very few investigations comparatively are taking place. It's beginning to open back up. But the whole system has had a shockwave. Even the American Psychological Association is identifying the increase for domestic violence. Child welfare is talking about the system being overwhelmed, and it probably will be for some time, even after things begin to open up a little bit. But that's not the only kind of stressful, potentially traumatic thing that children are exposed to. Just this last week, we had a tropical storm hitting the Gulf area, and I have colleagues I was on the phone with in Florida on Monday. They had flooding in areas of Miami, flooding in Tallahassee. If you look back even just over the earlier part of the year, the issues we had with families being separated at the border, more women and individuals of color have lost their jobs during the time of this pandemic, creating incredible economic stressors on families. There's also, it may not even reach the national media right now, but wildfires are starting back up in places like Arizona and California, affecting thousands and thousands of people. And of course, we're seeing the unrest taking place nationally as a result of the response to the systemic racism, the cultural response to that. And we are in tornado season in Oklahoma, by the way, just something else to not worry about. You noticed the 40-mile-an-hour winds last night. I hope no one, experienced damage in their home as a result of that. So there's no end to the potentially traumatic experiences that children can be exposed to. And right now they're not in school. Of course, they wouldn't be in summer anyway, but they missed the end of that transition out of the school year and had a lot of difficulty and stressful things as a result of that. So we'll go through this in detail, but these are the things, of course, most of us are familiar with, the things that can be potential exposures that can create traumatic stress for children. And we're very familiar, of course, with the ones on the top of the left-hand side, the physical, sexual, emotional abuse. A lot of children are experiencing neglect right now for a variety of different reasons. And that typically is the highest source area of exposure for children. But we don't want to minimize the ones just below that. Exposure to community violence is extremely high for youth in the U.S., whether it's in their own homes or in their neighborhoods, through schools, bullying, exposure to suicide, being bullied online, being sexually, non-contact sexual abuse online via social media connections. And that doesn't include anything on the right-hand side, the exposure to things like motor vehicle accidents. We talked a little bit already about the mass disasters, weather events, individuals who may be fleeing war or terrorism in their country of origin or experience refugee status coming into the U.S. 25% of individuals who are diagnosed with cancer, for example, will meet the full criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. So medical experiences, burns, disease, anything that would bring someone into an emergency room, accidents, etc. Many of our children have experienced significant traumatic loss, and we'll talk a little bit more about that specifically, but it can be a loss from any close relationship or circumstance in their life, loss of a loved one, particularly a parent, or many times children experience traumatic separation if they've been removed from home, if a caregiver has separated unexpectedly for whatever reason, children who have been removed from caregivers at the border, those kinds of things. And then there's also vicarious and indirect exposure for our children as well, who might be adjacent to someone else's trauma. And of course, anyone serving this population, any of us who work in the child service field, regardless of whether you're specifically working with child trauma, whether you are or not, you're working with child trauma, you're working with those exposures. So any or all of these kind of events can create a really significant sort of toxic soup that children find themselves steeped in for a period of time. And it can have an effect on overall development and function and even a lifelong impact. So we'll just spend a moment just looking at some things around that. I do want to use the terminology of the difference between what we're going to call acute trauma, meaning typically more of a single episode. Think of a single episode of domestic violence here, or a motor vehicle accident, something that happened once and didn't happen again, but it was overwhelming when it happened. One event can be enough to bring on full post-traumatic stress symptoms. Most of our children, however, experience chronic stressors. Multiple events over an extended period of time. We're going to refer to that as polyvictimization. I'll use that term again, probably. So where there are two or more types of exposures. Complex trauma is another term that's being utilized pretty widely in the field. And what we mean by that is not just the exposure to multiple events, although it is that. So multiple events happening over time. So thinking here about a child who's been exposed over a period of time to multiple episodes of, say, domestic violence, but there's also parental substance abuse, and they're being bullied at school, et cetera, et cetera. That would be a polyvictimization. Complex trauma adds to that for most of these youth, the source of the trauma begins early on in their development, and it's usually at the hands of those who are supposed to keep them safe and protect them. So their protective shield is, in fact, their most dangerous exposure potentially to trauma. So complex trauma impacts children in a broad array of ways in terms of emotional, social, their learning ability, even their physical development that I'll show you in just a moment. And trauma-focused CBT has been used effectively with all of these populations. So I want to zoom in for just a moment on the impacts of early trauma for younger children. Like with many things, whether it's Flint, Michigan water or other kinds of toxic exposures early on, the youngest children are the most vulnerable to those. And that's no less true of trauma and disruptive stress exposures in their family. So this toxic stress exposure, especially when it comes to the hands that are supposed to be the ones feeding and caring and keeping children safe, can permanently disrupt their lifelong attachment relationships. And it, more importantly, can literally change the structure of the brain. It can change the development of the brain in a number of ways. It can affect the structure of the brain, a range of development of the brain, everything from the size of the cortex to the volume of the ventricles of the brain, to the whole function of the limbic system, to how neurons develop, to how they talk to one another, and how they do their chemical tasks. All of that can be affected by chronic and traumatic stress. Doing so damages the individual's ability to manage their emotions, to record and use memory, so learn from their experience, to problem solve properly, to learn adequately in the classroom, to develop socially. So the impacts here can really, really be profound over time. And here's a visual of this. This is a PET scan, a positron emission tomography scan of 2 toddler brains. The one on the left is ostensibly a healthy toddler brain, and you can see there's diffuse activity all over the image. The brighter the colors, the more brain activity going on. So the bright yellows, the bright reds, the oranges, healthy, active, busy brain. The image on the right is a toddler who was raised in a Romanian orphanage, and they were fed and clothed and changed on a regular basis, but what they did not get was that individual stimulation. There was neglect. They weren't picked up and bounced and cuddled and cooed to and sung to and bounced on someone's lap. And you can see literally parts of the brain have ostensibly gone to sleep. There are large dark areas where there is very little activity, despite the fact that the brainstem is still fully active and doing everything it needs to do. So there are profound impacts that can happen for early child exposure to these levels of toxic stress that without early intervention may not be remediated over time. The good news is brains are very plastic. Children can respond very well with the right supports, especially the parenting supports and nurturance that they need. So some of the impacts they can have. I mentioned already trouble with attachment, trust, and safety. There's actually some literature in the adult literature about adult attachment disorders having their roots in early disruption of child-parent attachment. Disrupted neurobiology, mentioned that already. Trouble managing their feelings and mood is really a big fingerprint of trauma exposure, inability to manage one's emotions. So they may be highly escalated, easily set off, irritated, irritable, etc., or they may appear very zoned out, emotionally numb, disconnected, somewhat disassociated. Not surprisingly, this would be followed by trouble managing their behaviors, which is usually what gets children into referral for treatment. It's not those other things, it's when they stop working and behaving well with others, creating problems in the classroom. So they may have trouble acting out, difficulty paying attention, aggressive behaviors, high-risk behaviors. Those youth who experience these things have a higher risk of delinquency as they grow a little older, impacts their image and view of themselves as a valuable person, and therefore problem functioning in the family, which often was the origin source of the trauma in the first place, difficulty with functioning within the family. So I want to mention a little bit about foster care. As Gal said at the beginning, I worked actually for a behavioral managed care company called CENTENE that you've never heard of. You can Google them if you want to. They're a large managed care organization that has services in many states in the US. I'm part of our foster care division. So the training that I do for most clinicians are those who are seeing youth in foster care. So some recent studies that I want to mention, a recent national study as well as the findings of a task force found that about 46 million children per year in the US, which is 6 in every 10 kids, will be exposed to violence, crime, abuse, or maltreated. That number, by the way, 46 million, is greater than the entire population of the state of California. So we're talking about large numbers here. So it's been well advised that anyone serving youth learn about and provide on every level of service they do. It doesn't matter whether you're a pediatric clinic, if you're a community-based service program, if you're a mental health treatment provider, it doesn't matter, to cultivate trauma-informed practices. And if you're interested in information about that, just Google trauma-informed care through SAMHSA, and there's some great material there, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, some great material about what trauma-informed care really means when it's applied. So children in care are much more likely to be exposed to traumatic experiences: physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, family or community violence, trafficking, being exploited sexually, experiencing bullying or loss of a loved one, or all of the above for many children. It's usually those first few, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, that would get a child referred. Rarely is a child going to be referred to child welfare for community violence, bullying, loss of a loved one. But those impacts are certainly significant, especially when they have multiple ones. So besides the trauma and abuse that can lead to removal in the first place for children who come into care, there are secondary stressors that are part of that separation, being part of that system, the uncertainty of where you will be, where you will go, what will happen going forward, multiple placement changes, all of those things are significantly distressful for kids. So the long-term impacts for children who have been through foster care don't bode very well for them. More than a third of foster youth have 5 or more school changes during the time that they're in care. Well, why is that important? Well, the data shows that if you have 4 or more changes, you're twice as likely not to graduate from high school. Foster youth, in fact, repeat grades twice as often as children who have never been in foster care. Only about 2% of them will ever go on to finish a bachelor's level compared to 24% of the general population. So these are significant, not just educational, but economic and employment impacts that can come for this. 65% of foster youth will need housing after they're released from care, those who age out of the system. After age 18, almost a quarter of them will experience some point of homelessness, sleeping on someone's couch or not in a home at all. About 30% of youth who are alumni of foster care will have incomes throughout their life that are at or below the poverty level. Foster care youth are 5 to 10 times more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system. So they'll go from child welfare to a failed placement to behavior problems to juvenile justice. So we have a child pathway from trauma to prison for many of the youth in the US, internationally as well, but particularly for us in the US. So 25% of youth who were in foster care will have some jail time within the first 2 years after they're emancipated. 25% of foster alums will meet the full-on DSM-5 criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. That is, by the way, twice the rate of US combat veterans who served in Afghanistan. It's a significant impact. It is another epidemic, a public health epidemic that doesn't get much press. So I want to mention, this is sort of all brought to you by, if you will, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which I assume many of you have not heard of. Some of you probably have. This is a screenshot of the network map. Each one of those dots represents a network site. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network is funded and supported through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA. So the mission of the NCTSN is to raise the standard of care and improve access to services for traumatized children and their families throughout the United States. nctsn.org is the website. If you've never been on that, if you work with children in any capacity, you need to be familiar with the NCTSN. It is the national resource for child trauma information, bar none. So I really, I'll come back to that a little bit later, but I want to mention that. I had my opportunity for my trauma-informed training through a grant that we had when I was working through Family and Children's Services here in Tulsa, to become a part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And even though I'm not part of a funded or granted site at this point, I remain an affiliate member, an active member of the NCTSN. Still, it is a ongoing lifelong learning opportunity. So identifying youth at risk. The most common procedure is for us to screen every child who comes into any kind of service for any kind of trauma exposure and symptom. And this is not just a good idea. This is in fact best practices. If you look at the guidelines, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Pediatrics, the American Pediatric Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Counseling Association, Administration for Children and Families, so that's childwelfare.gov, SAMHSA. If you look at any of those organizations' professional guidelines, they all stress the importance that any child who comes into any form of treatment, pediatric care, doesn't matter what it is, should be screened for trauma. Have you had any of these exposures? If there's a positive response for exposure, then a symptom assessment should follow. So there are numerous now post-disaster studies in recent years that have identified risk factors that may happen as a result of the exposure to an event that could be generative down the road for both post-traumatic stress disorder as well as depression. Some of you on the webinar may be familiar with the ACE study. If you're not, it's not a mental health study per se. The information has really informed mental health treatment. But if you're not familiar with it, you do yourself a big favor by going to the cdc.gov website and just using that address, /ACE. It will pull up some amazing information. If you're not familiar with the ACE study, an ACE is an adverse childhood experience, one of the kinds of early events that we've just talked about that might occur. Almost 2/3 of US adults have had at least one ACE or adverse childhood experience. 1 in 6 have had 4. So this is not just a child trauma problem. This is an adult mental health and adult health care issue. ACEs underlie the top 10 causes of death in the US. So this is, again, part of that epidemic viewpoint trauma lens we're putting on things. So what is trauma-focused CBT? It's a hybrid. It's a MUT model. It incorporates CBT principles, of course. It's got CBT right in its name. It incorporates attachment, family therapy and family dynamics, psychodynamic, dynamic, and empowerment principles that have been melded into one model. And the goals are to particularly reduce the impacts of post-traumatic stress disorder, but also secondarily depression, anxiety, behavior problems, and other trauma-related symptoms for children and adolescents. This is just a child and adolescent model. There are other adult models out there that have a lot of efficacious outcome for trauma work for adults, but this is just a child and adolescent model. And it's designed to support ongoing adaptive functioning, build safety, improve family communication, and get children back onto a healthy pathway for developmental improvement. The training typically is for clinicians who are at the master's level or above, licensed or under supervision for licensure. So as I introduce you to some training resources a little bit later, that's the population that we're talking about. To date, there have been over 20 randomized controlled trials for TF-CBT for whether sexually abused or multiply traumatized children. Ages 3 to 18 have been assessed in the clinical literature. It's the most rigorously tested of all treatments for youth trauma. Now, 20 is not the total number of studies. That's just the number of randomized control trials. There have been far more studies done. Application of children in foster care, children from military families, children in residential treatment, children who have been sexually trafficked. So there have been a number of other studies, but the randomized control trials are your comparison studies where you're looking at a comparison group, et cetera. In all of the studies, the youth who received TF-CBT experienced significantly greater improvements in a variety of trauma-related symptoms at both immediate, post-treatment, and up to a 2-year follow-up. The average number of traumas for youth who received treatment was 3.5, 3.5. In my program at Family and Children's, that was our average number of traumas per child who came in, whether they're in child welfare custody or not, about 3.5. So most children would meet the polyvictimization criteria. PTSD symptoms consistently improved more with children who had the TF-CBT treatment versus others. That's not to say that other treatments aren't effective. Children can benefit from any other approach that we use to try to mitigate those symptoms. It's just the symptom improvements were about 25 to 30% better with the TF-CBT model. So over 80% of kids who have TF-CBT services for treatment show a significant reduction in post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, usually within 12 to 16 weekly sessions, which is the average number of sessions per case. It's not designed to treat everything in the child's life. What it's designed to do is dial down the trauma-related symptoms so children may be able to use other psychosocial models to support them in family relationships, other kinds of coping. In each of the studies that have been done, they looked at both child and parent outcomes. And you can see there where their parent symptoms have also been significantly reduced, even though the child was the subject of the treatment. Because as a didactic model, caregivers are actively involved in the treatment process when they're available. We can do TF-CBT. If we don't have caregivers, your outcomes are just going to be better no matter what if you have a caregiver involved. So that's true of anything. It's true whether children are learning soccer, bassoon lessons, learning to tie their shoes. If caregivers are all in, kids learn better, do better. It's been used internationally now. As of 2019, TF-CBT has reached all these countries and regions of the world. You'll see that Al and company, it's been trained in Israel. Our trainer, Esther Deblinger, has done a number of live trainings for TF-CBT in Israel. And if you're more of a visual person, here's a map to show any place that's blue has had training and or implementation of the TF-CBT model internationally. I'm not going to go over this slide. If any of you are interested in the clinical and other supports and endorsements of this model, you can pull the slide back up later, follow those links about the endorsements of the TF-CBT model. So engaging caregivers is really crucial if there's a caregiver involved. We're going to get the best outcomes. I mentioned that already. And it incorporates all of these things, forming a common alliance and helping to support the parent role, because our goal as a TF-CBT therapist is to put ourselves out of a job. We want the caregiver to be able to take over and help the child and step in, because there will be future stressful events, especially if you live in Oklahoma. You're going to have some pretty severe storms somewhere along the line. Scary things will happen. You will lose people you love. So we're setting up a system here to support children in an ongoing way. So we include the caregiver in all of the child's treatment. Therefore, it requires, we work with the caregiver, flexible scheduling, et cetera, and we're going to do a lot of education about the model, about what to expect, about how this takes place, et cetera. So I think about engagement as analogous to, say, having a car and a map. Typically, when it wasn't COVID, I was doing a lot of traveling to do my trainings, usually once or twice a month, being on the road, often landing in a city that I was unfamiliar with. So typically get a rental car. So I've got the car, but without some sort of GPS or map, I don't know where I'm going in a new setting. So engagement is similar, that if I can have a model that has really great outcomes, that's like the map. That's your GPS. That's how you're going to get where you're going. But if I don't have engagement with a caregiver, it's like I don't have a car. I got a great GPS, but I have no way to travel anywhere. So without engagement with the caregiver, kid may think that you hung the moon. They may think you're a great therapist, but if the parent doesn't facilitate that and doesn't help the child get into treatment or support that or serve as a coach, the outcomes are going to be nil to minimum at best. So I want to go through the components of the TF-CBT model. The developers have created this acronym of practice to be able to describe the components of TF-CBT. And the P on the front end does double duty. Now, they didn't create have an acronym and create a model to go with it. They had the model and then found an acronym that does a pretty good job of being able to describe the components. So the P does double duty on the front end. It stands for psychoeducation and parenting. The R is for relaxation, because I mentioned already in talking about the kinds of exposures, there's a lot of disruptive arousal kinds of symptoms as a result of trauma exposure. Children need skills to calm those down. So a heavy dose of relaxation, self-calming skills. There's no E in the first part of practice, so they couldn't use the word emotion. So they had to use affect. So affect identification and regulation and management are a key piece of the front end of this model. And then we teach skills for cognitive coping, because it's a CBT-based model. We're approaching that. So we affectionately call that section the practice skills. And then it's followed by a trauma narration component, where the child develops the story or stories about what happened to them and the opportunity to process that through. That may include some in vivo mastery components. We'll talk about that more in a moment. And then while we have caregivers involved all along through each of these components, the younger the child, the more involved the caregiver is, we have some specific strategic sessions a little bit later. The conjoint parent-child sessions, we have some specific structures we're doing there. And then last but not least, certainly, is enhancing safety. So the progression through the model, I'll show you that in a moment. But I want to introduce you to a child. I want to try to use a case example here as we're going away through this. This is a case I consulted on, and I tried to pick a case that was not easily identified and did not start out in the Tulsa area. So I want to talk about MJ. MJ is a 9-year-old biracial male who was seen at a child advocacy center in Kansas due to allegations of sexual abuse by his biological maternal uncle, mom's brother. He had been removed as a result of that disclosure, which kind of happened accidentally. He now lives with his biological mother. At the time, though, of the disclosure of this, they didn't know whether mom had a role in this, was protective or not. He was initially removed from mom, placed with mom's mother. His father had been incarcerated for a number of years, long history of substance use issues and criminal things that were related to that. Parents had been divorced for a number of years. So he'd been separated from his father for some period of time. During this time, they went through an investigation, really found out mom was not, she was a non-offending mother. She had not participated or known about the sexual abuse by her brother to her son. And they moved towards reunification to put him back in mom's home. Coincidental to that, father was being released from prison. So, and he was going back to his mother's house. So they needed to make some arrangements. They expedited his return to his mother. So the referral for outpatient services was for trauma-specific treatment because of the exposure to the sexual abuse. He initially came in with the grandmother, and then as the reunification was underway, mom came in to treatment with him as well. We'll call mom Anne, for lack of another name, and we'll call dad Damon, if I refer to him again. Some of the behaviors, lots of anger, mostly verbal, directed at mom because of the extended separation, being angry at her for that, being really sort of globally angry at lots of people. She saw a lot of anxiety whenever he was separated from her. So it was that paradox that if she was away from him, he was anxious, but when she was with him, he was angry at her. So that happens frequently for younger children as a result of the disruption. She admits to having a hard time disciplining and being firm with him because, quote unquote, he had been through so much. She was reluctant to discipline him. Teachers at school were reporting a number of difficulties: trouble concentrating, intrusive in the business and schoolwork of other children, yelling a lot. He'd been in a lot of verbal conflicts with peers, very easily overwhelmed by stress, and he would sort of shut down, seemed at times very distracted, but also rather indifferent to being redirected, and sometimes would snap back at the teachers or others if they would try to correct him. So none of these behaviors at school, interestingly, were reported by the previous teachers who saw him in previous years. So this was relatively new behavior. So that's MJ, and I want to refer back to him as we sort of go along through the model here. So the model may stage out this way for a typical TF-CBT case. I mentioned the PRACT skills that we affectionately call the first part of the model is really a stabilization phase. We're providing skills to be able to dial down some of the disruptive symptoms of trauma. The center part of the model is this trauma narration phase where we're directly exploring in a detailed and specific way their memories and their experiences of the trauma. And the final stages, we consider integration and consolidation phases where we may be doing additional in vivo work if needed, those specific conjoint sessions that I mentioned, and building in safety. So during the entire process here, the caregiver is also going through parenting skills and training. They're learning about the model, they're learning everything their child learns, and we're doing a little bit of gradual exposure to their memory and to their experience all the way through the model. As I mentioned earlier, typically the average number of sessions for a TF-CBT case is about 12 to 16, maybe 12 to 17 sessions. Those youth with complex trauma, however, that I mentioned earlier, that are going to have those disruptions in their attachments also, they're probably going to be more typically in the 25 to 30 session range for treatment. So I'm going to briefly go through each component and sort of highlight what we might cover in that component. But I mentioned already assessment. Assessment is really crucial, that we're screening children and identifying if they're having symptoms. Again, every child who comes in for any kind of service and care in a care setting of any kind should really be screening for trauma. It's that ubiquitous. And it becomes part of psychoeducation, helping children and caregivers to understand what trauma is, what post-traumatic stress symptoms might look like, what other symptoms might come from that, behavior, depression, anxiety, etc. We're educating about their diagnosis. We're educating about treatment. We're helping to make sense of their experience. So you probably have all heard that phrase of, you know, we're really trying to have with a trauma-informed perspective is it's not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. So we're trying to make sense of these experiences and be hopeful that we have a tool that can really help things to be improved. So safety, as I mentioned, is crucial on the front end. There's not just physical safety, but there's psychological safety. And we start with that as an essential element. Because even a helper can be a reminder. If people have gotten close to you and left you, then even someone helping you could be a reminder that when are you going to leave? You're my 15th therapist or my 4th therapist. When are you going to be gone? So it can be a reminder for children and reinforce avoidance and their desire to shut down and not talk about anything. We may need to do safety plans at this point. So there's a lot of things that are brought into safety at the front end. And one of the strengths of TF-CBT is that that comes from the order of the components that we've mentioned already. So this order has been found to be really the Goldilocks version. We don't want to tamper with this. They have done dismantling studies to rearrange the structure of this or minimize or even remove certain components, and the outcomes are not the same. So we want to maintain this structure to the best of our ability with a couple of minor exceptions. Psychoeducation can run all the way through the model, but it needs to begin at the beginning. Relaxation can go all the way through the model, but it needs to begin at the beginning. And safety. Some cases we may need to move safety forward to the beginning, and that's completely appropriate. So we may be doing a safety plan if a child is being currently bullied, if there's current community violence, if there's current violence in the home, then it's okay to move that forward. But we leave it in as the caboose of the model, particularly for sexual abuse cases. So the parenting component, the caregivers are receiving parallel skills to the child. They're learning what the child is learning. They're getting psychoeducation that's matched to the family's needs. What are this family's deficits, or first of all, strengths? What are your strengths for how you're dealing with discipline or distress or whatever is going on? And then where do we need to shore up those difficulties? So we want to teach skills for praising, being able to ignore the small things. So the eye rolls, the deep heaving sighs. Don't jump on every one of those little brush fires, because you'll never get to the bigger fire you're needing to put out. So teaching skills for selective attention, for redirection, teaching for younger children time out, contingency reinforcement, any of these things and others. So these are just some selected examples of things that might be taught during the parent component. We might be using functional behavior analysis. We might be using a number of different things. I mentioned earlier, TF-CBT is widely used for children in foster care and in residential treatment programs. So those situations where there may not be consistent caregiver involvement or a caregiver at all, and we have tools for accommodating that if it happens, if that occurs. I mentioned already that if you at least looked back in DSM-5, post-traumatic stress disorder lives in its own chapter, but if you looked back in DSM-4, you would find it under the anxiety disorders. It is sort of the mother of all anxiety disorders. And we know that anxiety disorders, disruptive things to psychophysiological arousal, require skills to calm that down. So we're helping children and their caregivers to develop individualized strategies to be able to cope and to relax that sort of match both the child's interests, their development, and their skills. So there's a myriad ways of approaching this in fun, interesting, creative ways to give skills to kids for being able to dial down that distress. I mentioned earlier, a real huge marker for trauma exposure is the inability to regulate one's emotions. So flying off the handle at the slightest distress, or being so emotionally shut down that you're numbed and avoiding. Those two extremes and everything in between. So we're teaching skills to manage their feelings with activities that are going to, again, match their interests and development. Exercises to practice identifying feelings, where you notice them in your body, how strong they are, feeling words lists. And again, we're going to make this very individualized to the child, because it's going to be different if a child has a lot of externalized behavior and expressive emotions, for example, anger, versus a child who's very avoidant, shut down, and very internalized. But we're going to be addressing both of the range of those issues. So everything from management issues to anger management, being able to stay present focused, developing a window of tolerance for distress, social supports, all of those things might be tools that we're doing as part of our affect identification and modulation. And we're also helping caregivers to be able to manage their own emotional circumstances, that if they're going to be a better coach and support for their own child, if they can learn to do this themselves. So we're doing all of this work parallel with the caregivers. Cognitive coping. Most of us did not receive training early on in our lives about being able to shift our thinking in a way to be able to manage our emotions. It's sort of left up to us as human beings to sort of learn this by the seat of our pants, unfortunately. We may have been fortunate to have caregivers that modeled this or even verbalized how to do it out loud. Most of us didn't get that exposure growing up. So no one's taught them these skills, and particularly for children in foster care or have been in residential treatment who have had often huge disruptions in their caregiving system. They've never experienced skills for being able to shift their perspective on something, shift their thinking in order to manage their behavior and their actions and their feelings. So we teach skills for cognitive restructuring, switching, being able to identify inaccurate and unhelpful beliefs versus accurate and helpful ones, or replacing them with them. Teaching skills for optimism, or managing negative thoughts. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Daniel Amons, who talks about identifying automatic negative thoughts as the ants that get into your stuff, and you're trying to get rid of the ants. So skills and strategies to be able to do that. So again, this is tailored to the individual child. We are not here talking about trauma-related thoughts and beliefs. We're going to address those, but we're going to address them after we've gotten the trauma story or stories out in the trauma narration section. Here we're teaching skills for everyday stuff that happens that gets us dysregulated. So because we're teaching that, a core element of this are the skills of, let's say, the tool of the cognitive triangle. Often clinicians use that as part of the tool. So we're going to change the language developmentally. So instead of maybe thinking, what is your brain saying to you? Or what feeling or mood are you in? Instead of behavior, maybe action or do, changing it to be something appropriate for the child. For younger children, we may put a jump rope on the floor in a triangle shape, draw pictures for each of these things, and play musical triangle. We're going to make it applicable learning-wise for the age and the development of the child. Some folks, you know, don't get excited about the cognitive triangle idea. It can be a circle. It doesn't have to be a triangle. One of my colleagues at the University of Oklahoma, Dr. D. Bigfoot, has written an entire application of the TF-CBT model for American Indian and Alaskan Native communities. And Dee would tell you there's no triangle as a natural symbol in Native American culture. There's a circle, so they use the cognitive circle. It doesn't matter what tool you're using as long as we're getting the interaction of these things and how they build upon each other together. Another way of approaching it is maybe this idea of, rather than a triangle, using a diamond. Because many children notice the sensory experience in their body before they notice the thought or can even identify a feeling. So what happened is maybe some stimulus and a blow up action, but maybe they could tell you they felt, you know, sick in the stomach or something else, or they felt like they were getting hot as their anger was rising. So they may be able to tell you a somatic sensation before they can tell you a thought or a feeling that was connected. So we're drilling down on these skills to give kids the ability to manage them. Probably the most novel component of trauma-focused CBT would be this trauma narration process. And trauma narration work has been widely used in trauma treatment. Everything that is in TF-CBT came from adult trauma interventions that were tested and vetted prior to the development of TF-CBT, used principally with sexual assault survivors, combat veterans. There had been a lot of work on post-traumatic symptoms. The developers evaluated all of that, looked at those components that had the greatest efficacy for reducing symptoms, and built a model for child trauma. But everything in TF-CBT was vetted earlier and comes in its origin source from adult trauma treatment. So in doing this, we're helping kids to tolerate painful memories. This is something in your memory. It's not really happening to you right now, even though you may be behaving as if it is, if you're still in the danger that you were in before. So in doing so, it's a gradual process, and we help them to gradually develop a detailed narrative of the event or events. There may be multiple. And then also, once the story or stories are out and developed in some specific strategies that we use to do that, then we work on those thoughts and beliefs that are embedded in that story that are inaccurate, unhelpful, or flat out untrue. So when children opt, for example, not uncommonly, children in child welfare who have been removed believe that the removal was their fault, you know, or the sexual abuse that caused that, or the domestic violence that led to that is their fault. And clearly it's not, but they hold on to that thought and belief, and it affects everything about how they move about in the world. So we're going to help them be able to look at that in more accurate and helpful ways. And in doing so, we help them with mastery overall, being able to cope with difficult situations. This page that you see, or the image that you see right next to it, is actually the first page of a child's trauma narrative who was sexually abused by a partner of the mother's. So I want to pause for just a second and talk about little MJ that I brought up before. MJ, when he came into treatment, initially was with grandmother, who was very caring and supportive, but really didn't want to get involved in his treatment very much. Although she was actually a better disciplinarian than her daughter-in-law. I may have misspoke earlier. He was with paternal grandmother at the time he first came into treatment. And she was pretty good at being firm and setting limits in a nurturing and loving way. Mom really struggled with that. So early on, we did a lot of parenting work with mom to be able to kind of let go of some of her guilt and responsibility around this, but recognize he still needs structure. He still needs limits. He needs appropriate boundaries. He needs to have consequences when they're appropriate for behavior. But he also needs to learn, some different ways of coping. So a big part of that happening in the early parenting and psychoed, a lot of psychoeducation for trauma on mom. Found out at this point, the mother had her own sexual abuse history by her biological father. She did disclose and was not believed and never had any treatment. So a lot of praise for mom that she's doing something now for her child that wasn't there for her, and giving her child an opportunity to heal in ways that didn't happen for her, and so help getting her on board more. They were wonderful about learning relaxation. Little MJ really liked relaxation skills. He loved bubble breathing, which is something we often use for younger children, teaching deep breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, using bubbles and other toys and things, other tools. He really enjoyed relaxation activities. He kind of took to them very well, but he also was a pretty active boy. So he liked to be outside shooting baskets and that kind of thing. So there was quite a bit of in his repertoire for helping him to manage the emotional distress. No one had yet taught him, though, to apply that to the distress that when he was feeling it. So it was really helpful for him to be able to do that. The affect work, that was more of a struggle for MJ. He would shut down around emotional content. He was afraid he was going to talk about something that was going to get him in trouble. He already knows that, when this was found out once, he got removed. He had an inaccurate belief that I talk about this again, something else bad is going to happen. I'm going to be removed again, or whatever it might be. So opening up the ability for he and his mom to talk about emotions and everyday things really helped that. She became a very good coach for him at home when he'd become distressed or seemed frustrated, being able to put his feelings into words. Where do you notice in your body, and not respond punitively to how he was managing his emotions. And that built his confidence that it was safe to talk about some of these things. So we began to talk about emotions in milder areas, easier everyday things to manage, and to make it fun. Often kids, when they come into treatment, particularly for trauma, it's often as a result of behavior problems that they've exhibited. That's usually the first ticket into counseling. So they expect they're going to have to talk about their bad behavior and how they can't handle anger. And they already feel guilty as heck about that. So sometimes starting with playful things, just being able to remember how good it feels to have a belly laugh and laugh so hard that you're going to cry. So maybe starting with reconnecting with positive emotions and helping them know that emotions are good things. It's what you do with them that matters. And it's okay to feel angry. It's what you do with it. You can bring social change if you're angry and you channel it in the right direction. But if you use it for breaking and entering and looting, then that's not helpful. That's on the opposite side of that spectrum. So there's a lot of approaches to using the affective work. He was reluctant. Mom was a good trainer in this. We got her involved and really helped build her confidence, and that really helped bring him on board. Interestingly, he was really good at the cognitive piece. He was a very internalized kid, so he thought about stuff a lot, and he liked feeling like changing his thinking was like a superpower that he had. That I can control my thoughts and no one else in the universe could. He really grabbed onto that. That was a delightful way that he took this on as something he wanted to learn more and more about how to do, how to get rid of those negative ants, those automatic negative thoughts. So he really jumped into those skills pretty well. He was, as most youth are, and typically more with middle school kids, teenagers, they're often more reluctant to talk about the events that happen. You can't, by the way, if you looked up the diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder in the DSM-5, you cannot have post-traumatic stress disorder without having avoidance, not wanting to think about, talk about, be reminded about, have anybody bring you to treatment for, none of that. You can't have the diagnosis unless you have a boatload of persistent avoidance. So we fully expect kids don't want to talk about this. No one wants to talk about the worst things that have happened to them, but doing so is absolutely crucial to healing. So we set up that parameter in a lot of different ways, and he was able to do his trauma narrative. So here's a teaching example. I mentioned earlier my colleague D. Bigfoot at University of Oklahoma, who's written the American Indian Alaska Native application of TF-CBT. They use a lot of teaching stories in their training version. And here's one from Dee's work, the story of the buffalo. So it's one way of conceptualizing the value and the power of talking about trauma narrative. Millions of buffalo once roamed the Great Plains from early spring into the summer months. The buffalo were acutely aware of approaching thunderstorms. And those of us in Oklahoma, we know how to fear a prairie thunderstorm. If you've ever been in it, if you've ever been in one in just a tent, you know the fear of the Almighty. They are not to be trifled with. When the buffalo sensed a storm was nearing, what was their response? The people saw that the buffalo ran into the storm. The buffalo instinctively knew that beyond the storm was calm, brightness, sunshine, peace, and grazing. What an awesome analogy for going through the difficult things, because they seem so overwhelming and so insurmountable and so powerful. They're therefore scary, and I don't ever want to think about or talk about them. So they live rent-free in our brains, and they do for our children, and they get to be the boss of that going forward. Their memories don't get to be the boss of them. They get to be the boss of this story. So here's a brief example of a trauma narrative. A child wrote about being a survivor. And many of our children will do them in chapter story kind of modality. Hi, my name is, let's say, Susie. I'm 11 years old. I'm a survivor. I go to blank elementary school. I'm a survivor of a scary thing that happened to me, and this is my story. So that's her like about me chapter that she maybe began at the beginning of her narrative work, and we'll go on to tell the story of that. And it doesn't have to be comprehensive. It doesn't have to be multi-chapter. They just have to be able to talk about the worst thing that happened. And we have a lot of strategies that we train about how to do that. The importance of doing this is that we have to make meaning of our experiences. Simply talking about our traumatic events isn't enough. If that was enough, we could just go to the barber or the hairdresser and be done with it. But children and adults need context to understand their experiences. So creating narrative alone is not sufficient to resolve this. Essential to this is be able to integrate those thoughts and feelings and the meanings about the event into a consistent and meaningful experience. So that's where the cognitive processing piece comes in, and making meaning. It's among the most important aspects of the gradual exposure work of this model through the cognitive processing. And it helps, again, to be able to place those experiences in context. So this is that same little girl I mentioned a moment ago. We had the first page of her narrative. This was her final page. This was a little girl who was had some developmental delays, who was about 9 at the time that she did this. It was a sexual abuse event by a partner of mom's. She was probably functionally at about a 6.5 or 7-year-old age developmentally. And she states it very clearly. I don't think about, let's say, Roy. I don't think about Roy anymore. I learned that if someone tries to touch my private body parts, I will say, stop, run away and tell a grown-up, like my mom or my teacher. It's never the, excuse me, it's never the child's fault. And that's her own handwriting. I'm happy now forever. And certainly we'd like to hope that nothing untoward happens again. So another way of looking at it is a quote from Gabriel Garcia Marquez. What happens in life, what matters in life is not what happens to you, but what you remember and how you remember it. Do you remember it as disempowering and feeling victimized, or do you remember it as something difficult that you went through? You're stronger, you're more powerful, you're more capable, all of those frameworks. So there may be a need for some youth, once they're finished with the trauma narration piece and the main stories of what they've had to talk about, is to have another layer of therapy. It's only used when there are other reactions to reminders that are innocuous. So for example, if a child we worked with a youth who had a drive-by shooting in his neighborhood and his best friend was killed. Now, we would not use in vivo work to desensitize him to gunshots. Gunshots are dangerous, so we don't minimize those. But if, coincidental to this event, he hid behind a green car, and afterwards seeing a green car was a really negative, distressful reminder. So he might need a secondary level of treatment to help him be able to manage that exposure in the future. And that's what in vivo work is. It's continued gradual exposure, but it's used to innocuous reminders. So a child is physically abused on a school bus and doesn't want to ride a school bus any longer. That's a safety thing. That makes sense in light of what happened. But if now you won't ride any bus, now it's generalized and it's become an avoidant response. So fortunately, MJ didn't really have any in vivo responses to anything that we were able to identify. But what we do in those cases is we teach about how this works, because it may pop up later and they may not have realized it. And I could give an example of that if that would be helpful. But in vivo literally means out of living, outside the person. So it's when they're responding to something external to them that they're having reaction to. And I mentioned earlier, the caregivers are involved, if we have them, all the way through the treatment in every session. But these are strategic sessions where typically what we're doing is the main part of this is the child is sharing their story or stories with the caregiver. We do a lot of preparation to make sure that can take place. We have a lot of specific techniques that we use to make sure that that's going to be a safe thing to do, and both child and parent are in alignment with that. But these are some of the most powerful healing sessions I've ever had the privilege as a therapist to be a part of. Amazing things happen for caregivers and kids. Walls are broken down, communication opens. Because I guarantee you, when a child can talk about being sexually violated with a parent, they can talk about anything else ever again, because everything else falls below the level of that in almost every situation. So some of the activities we may include here are coping skills that are going to be part of the development going forward. Again, sharing the story is a key piece of this, but doesn't happen in every 100% of cases. Sometimes caregivers are not able to, for whatever reason. An example might be a parent who has an active substance abuse problem and isn't stable, or active persistent mental health issue and would not be stable for that reason. So often what we can do in those situations, especially if the child is still wanting to include the caregiver, is they don't necessarily tell the caregiver the trauma-related content that might be overly distressful for them, but how I've changed, what I've learned, the making meaning chapter, how I'm stronger now, what I would tell other kids, how I'm different, what I'm looking forward to in my future. Those are all things that often could still be shared. So we're developing a context for ongoing safety, ongoing healthy development. So for children, particularly who've had sexual abuse, we need to talk about sexual health and what that means, and be able to open up that conversation so they can use the caregiver going forward to be able to talk about those things. Enhancing safety is sort of the last but not least. It's here, typically at the end of the model, because for many of the cases that were initially seen using TF-CBT, they were child sexual abuse cases. So if you think about some of the things we typically teach children about in terms of personal safety, if they're for body safety, it's about okay and comfortable and not comfortable touches, confusing touches. We teach about body part safety, permission for hugs, all those kinds of things. But we also teach about the right names for body parts. We're teaching the correct name for their genitals and not some euphemistic word that may be used in the family. But we're also teaching, typically when there's sexual abuse, that for younger children, well, older as well, you say no and you get away if you can, and if you can't, you sure tell someone. Well, if we had this piece of safety at the very beginning for a sexual abuse case, can you imagine for a moment what might happen? The child might think, oh my gosh, I didn't say no, I didn't get away, it was my fault. Great, we've just set up another inaccurate, unhelpful belief. So typically for sexual abuse cases, and a few others, some physical abuse cases, sometimes other cases of interpersonal maltreatment, we're putting all the safety in the caboose here. But for community violence, for physical abuse in the family, where there's ongoing safety, if a child's having supervised or unsupervised visits with a caregiver who might be violent, or they live in a violent community, they're being bullied at school, in any of those cases, we would move safety forward and pop it into psychoeducation and develop a very robust safety plan there. So safety is one of the components, along with relaxation and psychoed, that we can move around a little bit. We can move it to the beginning if necessary, or leave it at the end for particularly sexual abuse cases. So there's some variations and some flexibilities on how we can do that. So typically TF-CBT for the parent and child sessions are about 12 to 15 weekly. We have individual sessions with the child. We have some individual sessions with the caregiver, and conjoint sessions in almost every session. So what might typically work, and what we did for MJ, is Mom had not been a part of his initial treatment. Grandma had. So when Mom came aboard, the therapist worked with her to learn what AJ had learned so far, taught about what the CBT model was, taught about trauma, the impacts of that. And if you have a child who pushes back on trauma, so for example, youth who've had commercial sexual exploitation, they often will deny trauma has taken place. So we might utilize the term of overwhelming stress. Have you ever had a time when you felt really overwhelming stress, that you felt immobilized or powerless or paralyzed? Because you can't have trauma, you can't have PTSD without an experience of being overwhelmed and powerless. Those two things are ubiquitous to trauma. So maybe they would adopt that language more easily. That would fit more for the way they see things. But we are doing those sessions together. So in MJ's case, they brought Mom up to speed on what he had learned so far. And he was a couple of sessions ahead. He was actually finishing relaxation components. What we often do for younger children, and maybe even middle school age or teens, it depends on the parent relationship, is teach the child the skill and have the child teach the parent in a playful, fun way that they get to enjoy that parent's praise and excitement about doing it. And that's exactly what the clinician did. And this was a case that I supervised and did consultation with for MJ. We instructed the clinician to bring mom on board, do the psychoeducation, teach her about the model, teach her about trauma, normalize the symptoms. She did an assessment, a child abuse and trauma symptoms checklist, and so did MJ. Compared those scores, looked at how those scores relate to, how the symptoms relate to the behaviors and emotions that she's seeing at home. We also did a lot of parenting with her to be able to feel confident. Again, I mentioned this earlier, being able to put appropriate parenting skills in place and not back off on that too much to create too much ambiguity for him about what he's responsible for and what he's not. So then they blended mom into the sessions at about the relaxation point, and MJ was thrilled to teach mommy what he had learned and some of his relaxation things, and they practiced them together. Mom became a really, really effective coach at home. They created some reward sheets for him at home when he was doing his relaxation activities. She would sometimes do them with him, frequently would do them with him. We'd do them together at bedtime because he had some trouble sleeping. He'd get stickers for doing those. He was so proud of the progress he made with that. He was doing very, very well with that. So we want to integrate the caregiver in the same way. And then going forward, the clinician would spend maybe 15 or 20 minutes with AJ. For a 9-year-old, that's pretty rock and roll. If you get a 9-year-old to focus and do work for, 15 to 30 minutes in a session, you get the golden, prize for that. And then some time with the caregiver and time for them together. Usually in the PRAC components I mentioned earlier, those are the first components of the model, where we're creating stabilization. I usually clinically like to bring the caregiver in first for at least a few minutes at the beginning of the session. This is what we're going to cover today. Here's a handout on relaxation. Here's a list of feeling words that we're going to cover today. This is how I'd like you to be involved when I bring you in. So meet with the caregiver a little bit, find out how things are at home, anything going on that we need to address, any problems, any barriers, any improvements. Kind of get an update on that. And then I bring the child in for the child-focused part of that. And then we meet together for some good conjoint work at the end, talking about practice at home, et cetera. So that's very typical how a clinician would strategize how they do their TF-CBT CBT sessions, excuse me. Again, most of our youth have experienced traumatization as a result of interpersonal abuse. And that violation occurs in the result of a relationship or in the context of a relationship. So healing must occur in the same way, in the context of healthy and safe relationships for children to move forward. And as I mentioned earlier, for complex trauma cases, we may be in that 25 to 30 session range, but really very much the same sort of process. Where we put the extra sessions is in the PRAC skills. These kids are going to need a lot more coping skills, a lot more practice with that. But we aren't doing gradual exposure or the consolidation sessions at the end really any longer than we would typically. And we have data for why that's a good thing to do that way. I do want to mention that there are also additional grief-focused components for childhood traumatic grief and traumatic separation. Many of our youth, particularly those in care, have had multiple griefs. Many times by the time a child shows up at their current placement, by the time we see them, everything they own fits in a black trash bag, and that's the sum of what they have left. They have lost many things: pets, cousins, aunts, uncles, their school, their soccer team, whatever it might be. They've lost so many things. So often grief-focused components are helpful for that, or the separation components are helpful for that. But some of our children have also lost loved ones in specific and tragic ways. I'm staffing a case now from a clinician who's seeing a child in Florida who's in residential treatment. Father was incarcerated some years ago. Father sexually abused her when very young. There was a period of separation. He came back to the home and the sexual abuse started up, although now she was developing as a young adolescent. And she saw the relationship less as abuse and more as a relationship, a romantic relationship, very distorted. Father that was found out about, father was convicted and went to prison. And sometime shortly thereafter died in prison. So she's dealing with multiple very difficult things for her right there. Both her perception about that relationship with her father, as well as coping with that loss and his death, and her feelings and thoughts and beliefs about that. So fairly complicated stuff. So we have specific grief-focused components where we help the child to grieve the loss, what they miss about that person, or what they miss about the relationships, or the activities they used to do. We help them to resolve ambivalent feelings. And the girl that I just described is going to have a boatload of ambivalent feelings. I love my dad, but as I really stop and realize what happened, that was abuse. He took advantage of me. I can love someone and hate what they did. I can love my older brother, but hate that he physically, took advantage of me all the time, or sexually took advantage of me. We also want to help them to develop skills for preserving positive memories. And then the other task here is to help them to redefine relationships that have been lost in healthy and real ways, defining them as relationships that are now in the past. They are not active, real relationships now, and commit to present ones. So those are all pieces, and we have several details that are part of that development for the specific grief-focused components. So I want to spend the last of our time here. I think there's maybe some chat things, and maybe when we get to that point, I'm confident Gal will help me with those. But I want to show a few resources before we do that. I mentioned earlier we have a very robust implementation and training of trauma-focused CBT in Oklahoma. I'll talk about that in a moment. But if any of you on the call are clinicians, master's level folks, either under supervision for licensure or licensed or above, PhD, you can access free training, well, not free, you can access training online through the TF-CBT web. It provides 11 continuing education credits. It's a web-based approach where you learn at your own pace. There are very clear explanations about things, video demonstrations, actual scripts that you can download, resources and links. This is the web address. You can access it at. There is a $35 fee, but if you divide that out, it's $3.18 per CE. So probably many of you spent more than that this morning on a coffee beverage before you joined the webinar. So it's very, very affordable. This serves as the manual or text for the model, Treating Trauma and Traumatic Grief in Children and Adolescents. Really excellent book. It will not waste your time. It's not full of a lot of psychobabble. Excellent tool, and really encourage if you're going to try to implement the model, you should read the manual for it. This is the main page, a screenshot of the main page of the TF-CBT website. So you can see all the components of the model are listed here. You have to go through them sequentially. You would do a login, a registration. Login is, again, a small fee. But as soon as you complete the course, you have 11 CEs available for $35. So excellent way to begin your introduction to the model. Typically speaking, the course of training would be to follow this with a live training, 2-day training. We're doing those now virtually for the first time ever as a result of COVID-19. So we do have some of those available around the country, the virtual trainings. That virtual or live training would then be followed by consultation calls where an individual is practicing with the model with clients and receiving consultation from a trainer, clinician online. I mentioned traumatic grief. There is a supplemental online training for child traumatic grief, for the grief-focused components. This is meant to be done after this model or this training. So the TF-CBT training is the initial one, TF-CBT web. It could be followed by this additional 6-hour training, which currently is free, to download and understand and utilize those grief-focused components. They're extremely important. I tell clinicians who are working with child trauma, it's not a matter of if you will see a child who has experienced traumatic loss and traumatic grief, it's just a matter of when. So it's very, very valuable. There is a national certification program for clinicians who are interested in becoming nationally certified in the TF-CBT model. And that information can be found at this website, tfcbt.org. That's sort of the parent site of the TF-CBT model. But even if you're not interested in becoming certified, there's a lot of great information available for you on the tfcbt.org site. This is the main page of the website. Another valuable tool, even if you're not a clinician, is that you can locate a trained and certified therapist anywhere in the country by going to the Find a Therapist tab, clicking on that, and I open, for example, here, the Oklahoma page. And it starts in alphabetical order. You can rearrange this. You can query it by city. You could look at just Tulsa, just Oklahoma City, whatever. And you can find anyone who's nationally certified in our state. And currently, Oklahoma's doing well in terms of the number of certified therapists because we've been doing this for so long. So the TF-CBT.org is, again, the link to that address if you're interested, and click on Find a Therapist. If you have a child that you're seeing that you know who's been exposed to trauma and they're having symptoms, I would certainly consider the referral for trauma-specific treatment. I mentioned at the beginning, we've had an ongoing training and dissemination of trauma-focused CBT for over 10 years here in Oklahoma, and we have our own site, Oklahoma TF-CBT. This is a collaboration through the University of Oklahoma Center on Child Abuse and Neglect at the Health Science Center in Oklahoma City and our Oklahoma Department of Mental Health. And I've been proud to be a part of this dissemination project since the beginning. We do currently they're doing virtual trainings, but typically we do live trainings a few times a year and do the follow-up consultation for the clinicians. So it's a little bit hard to see, but from this page, you can find an Oklahoma registered or rostered therapist. So this is a Oklahoma map. And as you zoom in, those clusters actually spread out, and you'll see that there's often a number of clinicians in a given area. You can find out at what level someone's been trained. Have they just done the web-based training? Have they done the web-based training and the 2-day introductory live or virtual training? And or have they completed consultation? And or are they nationally certified? So you can find folks at all of that level in addition to resources related to trauma and treating children who've been exposed at this website, Oklahoma TF-CBT. So oktfcbt.org is the site. I mentioned also the National Child Traumatic Stress Network at the beginning, the NCTSN. I couldn't emphasize or encourage you strongly enough to take a look at the National Child Traumatic Stress Network website. There are also a host of learning resources available. The network has a particular section called the Learning Center. So if you go to the main NCTSN page and scroll to the bottom, you'll see a tab for the Learning Center. It takes you to this page. You can register and log in. There are curricula, there are training materials, there are a variety of resources that you can download for free here. There are over 300 CE eligible webinars. So if any of you are licensed and are looking for CEUs at our time of not meeting face-to-face, you can do online web-based trainings here. Each one of them is an hour and a half. You get 1.0 CEs for each one of them. They're all free and they're excellent. So I really want to encourage that website. But you can also find curricula and a variety of other material here, more than I can explain in the time that we have. So that's the Learning Center. Learn.nctsn.org is the exact address, or you can go to nctsn.org, go to the bottom of the page, click on the Learning Center. It will take you here. Okay, so it's just a brief summary. TF-CBT is for children exposed to a variety of different kinds of traumas and their caregivers, caretakers, parents, if they're involved. If they don't have them, we can still use the model, but really with like many things, children will not have necessarily the same robust outcomes. How many times do children present to an outpatient therapist and say, you know, I'm really having a problem with anger in my behavior, I'm getting in trouble with my friends, et cetera, so I want to come to counseling. Kids don't sign up that way. Someone else compels them to go to counseling. So you will get better outcomes with behavior, depression, and anxiety, social related symptoms if you have a caregiver involved, excuse me, but you can absolutely dial down the impact of PTS even without an active caregiver. And we have strategies for how that's done when children are in out-of-home care. We use foster parents in just the same way that we use biological parents. If they're in a group home, we may use some other staff, and we have strategies to address them. So it may be provided in as few as 8 or as many as 18 sessions for a typical case. It could be adapted to be longer for complex trauma. And it's a components-based and hybrid treatment, which incorporates highly efficacious principles to reduce trauma. And the outcomes have been noted internationally for kids and families. So that's the information I had to share with you today about TF-CBT. And I hope we have plenty of time for questions. I know that was fast, but you will have the handouts, I believe, to download at a later time and look at those other links as well. I do hope you take advantage of looking at some of the links that were in there.
Thank you, Roy.
Thank you, Gal.
Thank you very much. And we will give the participants a few seconds to see if we have questions.
So there's a question about handouts. Gal, can you talk about how those are provided?
Yeah, I will send the handouts after this lecture. Don't worry, you will get it. And this recording of this lecture is going to be in our YouTube channel. It takes a few days to upload them, but it will be there. So you can keep tracking the link. I put the link on the chat before. You can also open the mic. Mm-hmm. Sorry, Roy?
No, you said what I was about to say, Gal. I would be happy to answer any questions anyone has.
Hi, my name is Dana Lee Johnson. I was wondering what your experience was with parents who either refused to participate in treatment or gave you a hard time to work with, as far as the piece where you said that, you know, there's parallel work with parent and child.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, that's not limited to TF-CBT. You can have that occur with parents. You know, I did a lot of parent-child treatment before ever starting TF-CBT. That can happen with any modality that we're working with, especially if parents feel some sense of responsibility. So my hypothesis here is that there's a belief that's driving that. They have an idea about either why they are unimportant to the process and they could just drop the child off like, you know, something like a car being worked on and come back later and pick it up. Or they're fearful about some information, or they don't believe in counseling or the benefits thereof. I want to find out what the restraining belief is, because it's a cognitive distortion. It's an inaccurate, unhelpful belief. So if the child was going through a, you know, God forbid, let's say, you know, an intense medical procedure, they were having cardiac treatment in the hospital, they were having bone marrow transplants, they had, you know, anything, infusions for some sort of medication, parents wouldn't be non-participatory there. So it's part of the psychoeducation of the model to help parents understand that, and for me to do my best due diligence using the cognitive skills at my disposal to be able to encourage that parent to do so. It's not always successful. Often when it's not, the majority of the cases I can think of off the top of my mind where that was the biggest struggle were where we were dealing with teens, and there was such a history of behavior already and damage in that relationship with the caregiver that was more the culprit. But I'm going to work on that cognitively in every way I can. And I have a lot of sessions before I sort of have to formally invite the caregiver in if they're going to participate in, let's say, the trauma narration sharing. So I'll have a really good read by that point whether the caregiver can or can't. But I'll tell you quite honestly, in the more than 13 years I was doing this model at Family and Children's Services, I can count on maybe two hands where there were caregivers around. I mean, not that they're in some other state, they're incarcerated, where there were caregivers available where we did not include them in a significant way. And there were usually issues around court battles between the parents over the child, often due to some allegation, parent impairment due to substance abuse or mental health issues, and a few other extraneous examples. But that's avoidance. That if a caregiver's child has been through avoidance or been through trauma, whether they believe that or not, there's avoidance there. Whether avoiding it because they don't want to think about it, they don't believe it happened, or avoidance for some other reason, it's going to show them in an unfavorable light. It may make them feel guilty because of what happened, whatever it might be. That's a cognitive distortion, and I'm going to do my best to gently but persistently attack that. Not always successfully, but more successes than failures, I'll say.
Thank you.
I hope that was helpful. Sure.
Yes, definitely.
So in our cognitive coping section, we teach a number of skills to the kids even, and we use skills in Socratic questioning, cognitive restructuring, a lot of tools for that. And I'm going to use those same tools in how I approach what the belief is that the caregiver has. And I've seen them in all shapes and forms. I went through trauma, or I was a veteran. I went through harder things, you know, that kind of thing. So we've kind of probably run into about every shade of that you could think of. And again, not always successful, but we really try to improve that. So there's another question. Working with teenagers in the juvenile court system, many of the youth we see have parents who have substance abuse issues and or not ready for change. As you know, this greatly affects the child and causes continued PTSD as they experience this emotional roller coaster, when parents will sometimes show up in their life and sometimes not. Yes, we've had that. We have conversations with parents and encourage they get into treatment, but again, sometimes just not ready. What can we reasonably expect from these youth who do not have parental supports? You know, I'll tell you, if I had a simple answer for that, or even a complicated answer, I'd write the definitive book and retire. There is not a simple solution to that, but also not every family is unidimensional. So I've learned to respect that people make changes, people get into programs while they're incarcerated that, you know, bring about significant improvements and they become on board later. That happened in MJ's dad's case, by the way. He became actually actively involved in his treatment after his prison discharge, and had a lot of issues, but MJ longed for that relationship, as damaged as it was. So it ended up becoming a good resource. It just had to be handled, you know, in a delicate way. So to your question, you know, depending on the child's age, the conversation I'll have with the child about what's going on with caregivers will obviously vary based on their knowledge, their understanding. But very often when kids are in these circumstances, especially if they've been pulled into the juvenile justice system or in child welfare, no one has talked to them about what's going on with their caregiver. No one has made sense of this experience. What often can be a helpful way to construe this is very often their parents have also been through trauma. Let's go back to the ACE study here. They grew up being impacted by chaotic families, physical abuse, domestic violence, you name it. Now, not always, but for a frequent number of our families, they have their own earlier trauma. So trauma gets the blame for mucking things up here, not the parent, not the child. Not that people aren't held responsible for their behavior, not at all. But we can help them understand where this came from. So hopefully helping the child to not vilify the parent, but understand that they maybe have a disease, perhaps. Maybe looking at the disease concept or model for substance use as something that their parent is struggling with, and therefore they're not safe. And when parents aren't safe, they can't be parenting children because they're not even safe to themselves. How can they parent kids? Shouldn't drive cars, shouldn't do a lot of dangerous things. So therefore you have to be in a safe place with safe people or in a safe system for now. Doesn't mean it's always that way. And the more we can help you to improve and function better, who knows? Something like that may be happening for your mom or your dad to be able to stabilize as well and have a healthier function. So depending on the age of the child, you know, I vary how I would say that or educate around that. But before I even have that conversation, I want to start with what they think and feel. Do they think any of this is their fault? They weren't good enough? Somehow, you know, they're a cause of some of this. If only they behaved better, their parent would have done these things. Those are flat out wrong and erroneous thoughts and beliefs. And I want to take those apart and help that make sense. And then we might need to find a context to help them to understand what happened to what's going on with the parent. And, you know, the sad reality is kids have no control whether parents do what parents should do or care for them properly or love them. And that's a reality that they have to accept. Not any, I mean, harder, but not really any different than, let's say they had a teacher in school and they really had to pass this class or get through it, but the teacher just doesn't like them. I mean, no matter what they do, they can't get them to like them. They're getting worse grades or they're getting picked on a lot. You can't fix or change everyone, but you can take care of yourself. And we're going to help them double down on those skills. So that's a great example, Tara, also of a case where once we dealt with the trauma-related symptoms, this is a child that would need to be in ongoing counseling for a long period of time. A lot of support and things needed there. The other thing I would do is look for who else is available in the family as a support system that we can pull in. It doesn't necessarily have to be a biological relative. I'll mention just very quickly on this point, there was a new study that came out in spring of this year through in fact, my email address is on this slide here. So if anybody wants to email me, I can send you the link to the study. It was done at Brigham Young University. And they recognize that a lot of time has been spent studying adverse childhood experiences and the impact short and long term of that. Very little clinical study time had been spent on positive childhood experiences and the impact of that for children who have had ACEs. So if you've had a lot of adverse childhood experiences, what about the influence of positive experiences in your life? People who believe in you and support you. Positive school experiences, being a member of a team or a band or something that gave you esteem that you felt a part of. A support person who was really in your corner, youth pastor, grandparent, older sibling who's a young adult, whomever it might be. And the good news is the results of those initial studies are what they're calling counter ACEs, that these positive events can in fact roll back the impact of adverse childhood experiences, even for children that have had 4 or more traumas. So there's good news there. So I will search the bench for any adult that we can call on and get involved in this child's life. And sometimes we've had some remarkable successes with this. Former foster parents who, yeah, I'll be a mentor. They can't live with me again, but I'll be a mentor, or whatever it might be. A teacher who steps up, ROTC instructor. We've had some pretty remarkable experiences with that. So I don't know if I've fully answered your question, or at least given some ideas around that, but that's probably how I would probably approach that. Danley commented that intergenerational patterns of unhealthy family dynamics as a result of ACEs are a real thing. Positive experiences can be long-term protective factors. Absolutely. This study has begun to put some data behind that. There's actually another study, but it was involving moms during pregnancy and post-natally, and about those positive experiences as support. So not quite the same way, but the study at Brigham Young, I hope, will now bring some additional studies for this and really get that chorus going for the importance of positive relationships. Appreciate the questions.
Yeah, Christina, would you like to read the comments? We have also 2 comments. I think that
Sarah said thank you very much, and people are saying that this is a great training, which it always is great. Thank you so much, Roy, for your time.
You're welcome.
Are those the ones you were talking about, Gul?
the one about the school, but maybe Roy talked about it and I just missed it. So
I believe you already read the one that said I work as a subcontract employee, correct, Roy?
No, I didn't see that one. Sorry.
Okay. I'll read it for you. I work as a subcontract employee assigned at 2 elementary schools, piloting the trauma-informed care to teachers, aides, and staff coaching, and teaching them about triggers and trauma in high-risk identifying kiddos, using the ACEs to promote a healthy setting and trauma-sensitive setting. We do not have the opportunity and privilege to offer the recommended sessions, and the way training explains this. But we are promoting mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy interventions, and sensory teaching and self-regulating those emotions that they are unable to process or identify.
Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for what you're doing to help support that trauma-informed climate at the school. We work with a lot of clinicians who are doing school-based work. I have a consult call right now where half of the clinicians are doing school-based work. It's a challenge. I've done a little bit of school-based work, more home-based than school-based. It's a real challenge to be in someone else's environment and to have that flow properly. But you know, we saw many more children in our office-based situation who were seeing school-based support persons, but they were coming to us for. The good news is to help folks realize this is a time-limited treatment. They're not going to be on the couch until they're 50 years old. This is a brief model, so it can be done in a brief period to be able to get child back in school. Summertime is a perfect time. And now we're in a stage of doing these sessions virtually. So there are a variety of options, more than we've had before. So.
thank you, and we need to finish. Yeah, it's 12:30 in a minute. Okay. So thank you, Roy, so much.
Welcome.
And thank you for all of you to be able to stay with us 90 minutes. Thank you for your time. And we will see you in our other trainings. Thank you, Roy.
You're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity, Gal. Hope everyone has a great day.